We have reached peak overreaction international trip season. College basketball Twitter enjoyed Zion Williamson dunking from the foul line today because there was mostly nothing to talk about. But we'll try to bring you something to talk about anyway here on the CBB Central podcast. Brad, how's it going, my man? It's definitely the quiet time of year for college basketball, but I've been enjoying trying to get these little national trip reports, literally any nugget I can that provides me a little bit of a bump in college basketball talk.
I'm doing pretty good, but I'm a little disappointed because I don't know if I was just, wasn't looking hard enough, but I couldn't find Ohio State's games being streamed. Providence probably isn't going to stream their games from what I read. So, all these foreign trip talks, we're going to have to rely on shaky firsthand observation and box scores. I wish I could be watching these games. We have probably about 2.5 months until the season starts.
Yeah, especially with like Periscope and stuff. Like, obviously I'd prefer a good stream, like at least like a one camera situation. But with Periscope and stuff, I don't see why more teams aren't at least doing some sort of streaming to let fans watch the games. It's just a great way to connect. I don't know, maybe there's a reason why that I haven't seen. I know there's been like some teams have complained about like cell service, but like to me, some sort of live stats or a streaming service shouldn't be that complicated to set up for one of these trips. So definitely a little bit frustrating, but we got some big news through college basketball this past week, at least for August. A couple of recruiting news, a couple of transfers to touch on. Let's start with Kira Lewis, the top 30 point guard in the 19 class who reclassifies and heads to Alabama. I said at the end of the last podcast, Brad, that we pretty much knew he was going to Alabama. We didn't really know whether he'd go 19 or 18. He chooses to come early for the Crimson Tide, and to me, this is a huge get. I think it really changes my outlook on this team. Adding a point guard who can really score the basketball, who can. I've been really concerned about this offensive efficiency in the backcourt between Dazon Ingram and John Petty, two guys I'm not really that high on. To add a point guard like this really changes my outlook on the Crimson Tide.
Absolutely. I mean, his whether he starts or he comes off the bench in like a sixth man role. Adding another guy who can create offense, who can handle the ball, is just so huge for this team. I actually kind of like Ingram. I like that kind of mold of like the bigger physical point guard. Ingram's like 6'5" or 6'6". Obviously played off the ball last year next to Sexton, but has some experience playing point guard. And I just love how long and versatile and athletic this Alabama team is. And they have a lot of really good shooters too. I think the one kind of question mark is kind of the offensive creation. But I mean, starting lineup of Ingram, Petty, Herbert Jones, Tevin Mack, and Dante Hall. That's 5 guys between like 6'6" and 6'9". You have guys who are multi-positional. All 4 of the perimeter players, besides Hall, can shoot the ball, and then Hall is an NBA prospect, kind of as a 5th or 6th big like energy type of guy. So I mean, this is a very deep team now that they added Lewis, and this addition cannot be overstated.
Yeah, I tend to lean towards starting Lewis. And I like Dazon Ingram as a player. I just don't necessarily like him as a point guard. Their offense was pretty inefficient the year he was their point guard. They really grounded out, and they tried to win on their defense. They were unable to really create a lot of offense. So I think that's my reasoning for going with a guy like Lewis to start a point guard. I don't know really how that leaves you. I think Jones, Mack, and Hall are pretty much locks to start. So it becomes, do you start Ingram off the ball and bring Petty off the bench, which I think is probably the more likely outcome, or do you, for the sake of the spacing, play Petty at the 2 and let Ingram come off the bench as like a 6-man creator? I think you'd probably at least start the season with Petty off the bench, but we'd have to see what happens. But I generally do agree, Brad, that I like the look of this team. They even get like guys like Riley Norris back who can shoot the ball off the bench. They've got a pretty good 9-man rotation. They might be even worth a podcast at some point because I'm pretty excited to watch this team.
Yeah, I don't think it would be crazy to put them in a top 25. I have them in that kind of low 30s range. But I mean, if someone had them in the top 25, I certainly wouldn't scoff at them. And that would make 7 top 25 teams for the SEC, which is up there for the strongest conference. I think you can make an argument for the ACC, which is I think more top heavy than the SEC. in terms of that bottom half of the ACC gets ugly really quick. And then you have a conference like the Big 12, which is obviously smaller, but has,
Yeah, overall, I think with this team, this Bama team is going to be really decided by the spacing, as you said. But this league is so deep; it's going to be tough because like there's teams like Vanderbilt, Bama, who definitely have the top 25 level talent. But at some point, they're going to beat each other up. So it's going to be really interesting to watch that progress as the season goes on. Biggest news also we wanted to touch on was Terrence Shannon off the board, 2019 top 75 wing, headed to DePaul. Want to know your thoughts on this pickup, Brad, because obviously now this gives Dave Lato a potentially top 20, top 15 recruiting class in college basketball, one of the top recruiting classes in the Big East next year, and a core you can build around in Chicago.
Yeah, I think DePaul's team is not that bad. I mean, we've talked about it a few times. They were 99th in KenPom last year, and I think they're probably a little better this year. But it's just so hard to climb out of the basement in a conference like the Big East. But in terms of their roster for next season, between Weems and Shannon on the wing, they also have Darius Hall, who's an Arkansas transfer who played a fair amount in the rotation for Arkansas. Then you have a knockdown shooter like Jalen Coleman-Lands. I mean, even if DePaul stays in the basement, they're going to be a stronger bottom feeder, which makes the Big East so much stronger because there's no more minefields where a loss at DePaul isn't going to be a bad loss. Even maybe a loss against DePaul at home won't be a bad loss, and picking up a win on the road could even be a quadrant 2, or maybe even they sneak into that top 75 and get a quadrant 1 win.
Yeah, and I just think with this DePaul team, it does kind of stink that a guy like Eli Kane, a guy like Max Strus won't be there for that group. If nothing else, because you kind of need to build momentum. I mean, Weems and Shannon help you a lot, but I don't think it moves the needle enough to make them, an NCAA tournament team, which is obviously the long-term play. But as you said, there's a nice core building. You have Flynn Cameron coming in this year as a fringe top 150 recruit. You have a couple guys coming back, Darius Hall, as you mentioned. So they have a chance to be interesting. The front court's been a problem the last 2 years. They've just kind of covered it up with a grad transfer. I like Jalen Butts. Maybe he's the guy long-term who can develop into that at least starting caliber Big Ten center or Big East center. Apologies on that one. It'd be huge if they get out a third piece to this 2019 class, usually like a long-term big man in that fringe top 100, 150 range. Like they were looking this year with Brian Penn Johnson. They were involved with him. He would have been the right caliber big man for DePaul to pursue, who could be a long-term play at center. They haven't really been able to land that so far, though. So that'll be interesting to watch. But definitely, Chicago basketball is better with DePaul. Big East basketball is better with DePaul. So hoping they can get it turned around. I still don't know that Dave Lato's the guy. And that's kind of the unintended consequence of this is Romeo Weems might have kept Dave Lato's job on its own. Romeo Weems and Terrence Shannon definitely keeps Dave Lato's job, at least for the 2019-20 season.
Absolutely. And then moving on to our kind of third most notable transfer, that would be Sam Cunliffe. Cunliffe, played a semester at Arizona State, then transferred to Kansas, where he was, buried on the bench, widely kind of unsuccessful there, and is now off to Evansville, where he'll join Walter McCarty's team. So Kevin, what do you think about this impact mid-major addition?
I was a little bit surprised that he did commit to Evansville. It was one of those where they didn't really make sense on the list of schools pursuing him. So there was a gut feel that he was going there, if that makes sense, where like Fresno State made sense, like a West Coast Mountain West team. Grand Canyon made sense. Arizona team that has a lot of upside and recruits a lot. Minnesota, a power conference school. Things like that. Those were the schools that were mentioned the most with Sam Cunliffe. And so Evansville kind of stuck out as the odd man out, which sometimes means that's the school is going to get him, and that's what happens. A 6'6" athlete who can shoot the ball like Cunliffe is a major pull for a Missouri Valley program. I don't want to compare him to Milton Doyle, a Kansas to Missouri Valley transfer who became, a really great player at Loyola Chicago, but I think he can make a similar impact as like a 15 a game type scorer in that conference. And so definitely Walter McCarty's done a pretty good job making some under the radar pickups for both this year and for the future. But this was the high profile dig that every first year coach wants to make a statement to your fan base that you're going to make a move long term.
Yeah, and they're going to have to rebuild after losing Taylor and Drew Smith there. Evansville was a very interesting sleeper team for me a few years ago when they had what's his name, Ejidijus, like Muskavikish, their center who had a cup of coffee with the Nets. Excuse my pronunciation. And then they had another scoring guard too, whose name escapes me. And they had the coach's son. I think his name was Blake Simmons, like a nice glue guy there. That was an interesting team a few years ago that I think got a little unlucky with injuries.
But yeah, I mean, going forward with Cunliffe, they bring in also a sit-out transfer in Art Labinowicz, who averaged about 10 a game at Coastal Carolina, so like a useful rotation player in the Missouri Valley. A decent freshman class that they had to sign late with some upside pickups. So it comes down to this. I mean, they definitely need a bigger class in 19 and maybe grab a grad transfer or two, but they seem to be gearing up for a couple years, being able to maybe make a run in this conference. So it's always good to see, small programs that have been near bottom of the league for a little while, all of a sudden really gain some energy and gain some momentum.
And then lastly, we have two players who are kind of in strange recruitments, strange situations. First, we have Kadeem Sy, who was the backup center for Virginia Tech. He may have even started some games 2 seasons ago. He projected to be the backup behind Kerry Blackshear last year. He bailed, supposedly went to JUCO, then came back, but obviously wasn't eligible to play. Last season, he was geared up to be a pretty important bench piece for them this year and be that backup center again. He has gone back to JUCO and left Virginia Tech. So, Kevin, how big of an impact do you think this departure and this kind of strange move from Kadeem Sy makes?
It was a bigger deal last year when he left than he left this year because they were pretty thin up front this past season. They're a little bit better shape this year. So I don't think it's a huge deal to lose Sy. I thought he was a nice long-term big man who could play rotation minutes, and rotation big men in a power conference is never easy to find. But sounds to me like a situation of guardian or host family situation being a little bit overprotective or a little bit manipulative. That's kind of the word on the street that I've been getting. So it'll be interesting to see where he winds up after JUCO. Definitely a high major player for me, though. He was a useful player as a freshman in the ACC back in the day, 2016-17.
Yeah, because I mean, even for Virginia Tech, they don't add like a new player, but PJ Horn, who was kind of their backup center for a lot of last year, he's a year older. I believe Chris Clark played a lot of small ball 5. I mean, he'll be back as a senior. He's super athletic, kind of a do it all kind of glue guy. Very athletic player at the 4. And they also have Landers Noli, who I think is going to play a lot of small ball 4 for them. He was like a wing shooter type, who I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he committed to Georgia, and then like the next day he decommitted. Is that right?
Yes, it was an immediate one, which brings up our final.
Yeah, what a segment!
Well done,
segue.
All right. So Jaquan Walton, top 100 recruit, was committed to Mississippi State on, I believe, Saturday, and by Sunday or Monday he was decommitted. It was like a flash in the pan, to say the least. I have the quotes up from his mother, who posted a big long thing on Facebook. I'm not sure if you saw this, Brad.
I did, yeah.
It's no secret in Division I conversations among programs that I wanted MSU more for my son than he wanted the institution for himself. I excluded him out of his own choice when he trusted me. He silently agreed to go. Jaquan no doubt likes MSU as a program, just not for himself. He kept telling me he did not want to go, and I kept aggressively reminding him the hard work and continuous effort they put in, and that they deserve him more than any other university. No matter how much I celebrated MSU, my son still had no full interest. MSU worked harder at recruiting my son and the family as a whole. They made sure I was comfortable with my son's academic advisor. They checked on him the most. He bonded well with the assistant coach. However, his heart is and was not ready. Because he is not ready to commit, and it's not my decision, I humbly step back. Jaquan Walton is decommitting from MSU and will be making his decision in a few weeks with the collaboration of his supporters. So looks like Mississippi State is not the choice for Jaquan Walton. This is in a situation where he might come back and just wants to take his time. What do you make of those comments, and what do you make of losing Walton's commitment if you're Mississippi State?
Kind of three big ideas for me here. Number one, it's super ironic that the mother made a statement about not giving Walton his own choice. Like she wouldn't even let him make his own statement. That was pretty interesting. Number two, I think it's also kind of interesting that I think the team that people had as like second place for Walton was Georgia, the team that we just talked about with Orlando Noli that got flipped on earlier. And then thirdly, I love the transparency and like the honesty here, where she's like, he didn't want to go. I kind of made him because I liked like the academic advisors there and stuff. So that was quite unusual. You even if a situation like this happens, and I'm sure it happens all the time, like the parent or like whatever party kind of reports this never admits with such honesty and with such straightforwardness, that like he had no interest in going here, and I made him go here. Like even if that's the case, like with a parent directing a player, it's usually has more flowery language.
Yeah, that's the thing is like I always find it funny when people read into the comments made by players after they commit, like, oh, it was all about my relationship with the assistant coach, or et cetera, et cetera. Like, I'm gonna be honest, most of that's bull. Like, it's an easy answer that they see made all the time, so they roll with it. And I'm sure the assistant coach had a great relationship with the kid, but a lot of times it's like, are you gonna play? Did they give you money? And I'm not gonna be naive here, like that happens. The mom pushes them, the dad pushes them. So this was a really interesting insight into what Mississippi State did in the recruiting process and how it didn't work out. But yeah, overall, just a weird situation that developed over the weekend that I thought we should touch on the podcast.
Okay, I think that does it for notable recent news since last time we talked. So we'll start with our deep dives, which this week we focused on Xavier and Western Kentucky, and we'll start with Xavier. So the Musketeers had a great season last year. I mean, they were 29-6 overall, 15-3 in the Big East. They won the regular season Big East championship, which a lot of people forget because Villanova obviously won the national championship. But that's a very, very crucial point that's not to be forgotten. But unfortunately, they lost in the second round of the NCAA tournament to Florida State in a game that they were up by almost 20 points, I think, and then they kind of let their foot off the gas, and Florida State came roaring back. They had an elite offense last year with Trayvon Blewett and J.P. McCure, who are now in the NBA, with the Pelicans and the Hornets, respectively, and also with Karim Cantor, who is the younger brother of Enes Kanter. He was a grad transfer center who was an excellent offensive player at the 5. But the numbers didn't really favor Xavier. I mean, they were 15th in KenPom despite being a number 1 seed, and that was a common thread throughout the whole season, where they were much higher in the AP poll and kind of the more subjective rankings than the data-based rankings. And there was a great all-around offensive team, and kind of this shift happened kind of mid-season where Chris Mack went with Karim Cantor instead of Tyreek Jones in the starting lineup, and then put Najee Marshall in for Kaiser Gates, and that kind of sparked their offense and took this team to the next level.
Yeah, it was definitely it was an interesting team to watch all season because they won a lot of games, but they never really moved the needle for me, and the metrics kind of backed that up. They played a lot of close games, and they were great at winning close games. At one point in the season, they weren't undefeated, but they had like 2 or 3 losses, and they just kept winning like 4-point game after 4-point game. And I was like, this team may never lose again. They're just so experienced, and Blewett and McCura were so good. They made such big shots late in the game. So I think that might be my biggest concern kind of going into this team is just how do they manage? They don't have 2 big shot makers and 2 clutch shot makers from last year, 2 of the best in the country. And how do they balance that?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I mean, probably the game that that sticks out most to me is they were on the ropes against East Tennessee State in like November on like a Saturday afternoon. They were down by I think like 22 points and had a crazy like late comeback to avoid dropping a pretty terrible loss for their resume. But yeah, I think offense is probably the biggest concern with this team. I mean, whenever you lose, your three best offensive players in Blewett, McCura, and Cantor, and then also a stretch four in Kaiser Gates and a guy who could score in the paint in Sean O'Mara. I mean, there are a lot of holes to fill on this roster. Interested to see where you kind of see the starting lineup and kind of these next man up rotation here for the Musketeers.
Yeah, but let's start with the recruits, the guys coming in, because they do have a pretty large group. 3 grad transfers and 3 freshmen, to my knowledge, as well as a sit-out transfer. But he will be walking on, so I don't know how important he is. Grad transfers, Kyle Castlin from Columbia, a solid guard who I think will play in the rotation. There's been a lot of good words said about him in the media, about him being a pleasant surprise. He's a guy who I wasn't necessarily high on as a player at Columbia. Just pulling up his stats real quick. To me, he was more of just like a good rotation player. Averaged 10 points, 4 rebounds, an assist and a half, shot 50% from the field, 35% from 3. But just a good shooter, a leader, a guy who can probably play off that ball. So at the 2, so it should be at least a useful player as a grad transfer. Ryan Wheelidge, big floor spacer, elite shooter at 6'9", 190. Who'll be that stretch 4, and then Zach Hankins, a D2 grad transfer from Ferris State, one of the best D2 programs in the country. He's expected to get a lot of minutes at center right away. So a lot of plug-and-play aspects to these grad transfers, kind of the perfect fits of grad transfers, filling rotation minutes right away, playing a role, not necessarily a superstar in any of them. And 3 freshmen, Keontae Kennedy, a late commit from Texas, who can play the 2. Dontarius James, who ranked in the top 200, was right around the 200 ranking, like a 6'7" combo forward from South Carolina. And then Jake Walters, the number 1 rated recruit in this class, who's 189. So no real high profile names in this signing class. More of a developmental piece from what I've seen. 189 in the recruiting ranking, 7 foot, 270. A long-term piece at the center spot, but definitely seems like Hankins has the inside track to start this year. Wouldn't even surprise me. It would surprise me if he redshirted, just because Walter, they do need a little bit of depth in the front court, but at the same time, he's definitely more of a development piece than a guy who I expect to make an impact this year.
Yeah, I think Walter's a very interesting player for Xavier, because I mean he's huge. I mean he's 7 feet and 270 pounds. That's what he was listed at. And I completely agree. He's a long-term piece, and it seems like Xavier really favors or like really finds this archetype like appealing. They feel that they can get a lot of value out of this archetype with guys like Matt Stainbrook, and before him, Kenny Freeze was another of these like big-bodied, pretty skilled centers. And they signed a guy last year, Ken Travius Jones, who never made it to campus. He's going to Oklahoma State for this year. He's another guy in this mold, like this super big body center. So clearly the staff finds value in this type of player, feels that they can maximize this archetype. In terms of Hankins, I think Hankins is probably the guy with the I'll say I think he is the guy with the most potential among this group of 6 newcomers. I mean, he was the Division II Player of the Year. He won a championship in Division II at Ferris State. I mean, he was a good rim protector, and he was a skilled offensive player, especially with his back to the basket, and he can really pass the ball. That's skill sets that are highly coveted for the Xavier team. I mean, they have a great set of perimeter defenders, and to add a guy who can protect the rim, could really take this defense to a whole nother level.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he's definitely the inside track to start. I think just kind of looking at the rotation, it wouldn't surprise me if the 2 grad transfers wind up starting next to each other in the front court, and Hankins and Wheelidge. Just to me, that what feels like a natural 4 or 5 combo early early on for this Xavier team, and I think it fits pretty well together. A big man who's very efficient in the paint, who could protect the rim in Hankins, and then a pure shooter in Ryan Wheeledge, who averaged about 17 points a game last season at San Jose State. Now, San Jose State was very bad, but 18 points, 5 rebounds for Wheeledge. Shot 46% from the field, but 43% from three, despite being circled, starred, highlighted on every scouting report you could find. So he's definitely a very useful player for them. So I might say he's the biggest impact newcomer, although Hankins' value might overtake Wheeledge's scoring production.
Yeah, that's what kind of gave me pause when saying that Hankins was the most impactful, because Wheeledge, with his ability to space the floor, especially with Kaiser Gates gone, even though Gates saw his role drastically decrease as the season went on, 3-point shooting with this current group of Xavier players is highly valued. I mean, between Gooden, Scruggs, and Marshall, they're all kind of below average 3-point shooters. I know Gooden shot it great in a Big East play. He shot 40% from Big East play onward, but he was still like a 30% shooter, I think, overall. So I mean, he needs to be a more consistent long range threat for the Xavier offense to be even good, because I mean, besides Wheeledge, Marshall's a solid 3-point shooter. Scruggs was not a great 3-point shooter last year, but having that kind of stretch four at that spot makes it it's such a great fit, and adds this kind of synergy to the Xavier lineup. And then in terms of the center position, I have Tyreek Jones starting for the start of the year. I think he has the lower ceiling and the higher floor in terms of minutes. I think if Hankins is the clear guy there, I mean, he could play up to 28 minutes a game, whereas Jones, I think he's more of like a safe pick, and he adds a lot of rebounding and a lot of kind of physicality that kind of fits with this Xavier roster as well.
Obviously, with a new coach, this may change a little bit, although Travis Steele comes from the Chris Mack coaching tree, has worked very closely with Chris Mack throughout these last few seasons. They've always split their center minutes fairly evenly. I know last year they split them. Obviously, Kareem Cantor got a little bit of time at the 4, but for the most part, but Cantor played 16 minutes, O'Mara played 15 minutes, Tyreek Jones played 15 minutes, and both all guys really playing for that. Those 40 minutes at the center spot. In the years past, they've done similar things when they haven't had a star at that spot. So I could see like a pretty even split in minutes between those two guys. Allow them both to bring energy, both bring that toughness and rebounding. Jones is a really good rebounder, averaging about 5 rebounds every 15 minutes. Those are very good numbers for on a per 40 basis. So definitely going to be a useful player in that front court. Definitely will factor into the rotation. I think if you're creating that front court, you're definitely going to have Hankins, Jones, Wheeledge, and then probably someone will back up and play the 4, because I know Chris Mack's philosophy, and I would assume Steele will adopt this as well, of sort of position locking guys, especially as freshmen. They don't necessarily have a clear 4-man to back up there. But that'll be an interesting kind of fit to watch. Although I do like the potential of maybe some small ball lineups with Najee Marshall at the 4 and going a little more guard heavy.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly that I think Xavier's best defensive lineup, I think, will definitely be with Marshall at the 4, and then either Jones or Hankins, if Hankins' shot blocking kind of translates with them at the 5. But going Gooden, Scruggs, Castlin, Marshall, and then Hankins or Jones, that's a really solid a perimeter group with all 5 players are excellent defenders. I don't know if there's enough offense in that group without Ryan Wheeledge in there, but certainly that's a lineup that will be used pretty frequently, you would think, unless Dontarius James is a ready-made contributor. He's someone who looks that part of like a college power forward. He's a very physical kind of combo forward who could also see some time at the 4 if he is ready.
Yeah, I think he's probably ready to play with some rotation minutes in that 8 to 15 minute range. I would say probably right. Seems right early for him. I do think we should point out that Xavier's been as good as any program in the country in player development over the last several seasons, and Guys like Najee Marshall, guys like Paul Scruggs, even a guy like Elias Harden, who didn't get a lot of run last season, have a chance to really develop into and take the next step as players. Marshall's the guy I think I'm most excited about, though Scruggs is terrific as well. And I think that's something we do have to kind of touch on with the Xavier program is how well they've developed players, and I expect that to continue with Travis Steele. And that's why I really like the job that Steele did in recruiting is he brought in these grad transfers who can help these guys learn. They can give pad, but doesn't really compromise the long-term future, doesn't recruit over these guys that he perhaps promised minutes long-term that he committed to and believes in their long-term upside in terms of, guy like Scruggs. It would have been easy, a solid freshman season wasn't anything spectacular. Would have been easy to go grab a Sam Cunliffe or any of these top shooting guard transfers and basically say, sorry, your spot is taken, or at least competed against. And he really holds up his end of the bargain, brings in a guy like Castellan, who's going to be a very useful player, who's going to help Paul Scruggs develop. And I think Scruggs is going to have a big year. So it's one of those things. I think we've talked about this on several podcasts, Brad, where teams over recruit pretty quickly, and not necessarily maliciously, but with the example of like the Mountain St. Mary's transfers now not looking at maybe getting as many minutes as they would have thought, it becomes very easy to just move on. And so for Xavier to really have a vision with their scholarships is always good to see.
Yeah, I'm very high on Paul Scruggs for this upcoming year as well. I think he's certainly going to average double figures. I think it would have been very hard for Xavier to get a grad transfer guard in there that would be better than him. But that's why I think Castellan is such a good addition because, as like that defensive role player and kind of the Malcolm Bernard role from 2 seasons ago, where he's going to play a lot because he's a quality defender. He's an older player who can be relied on in various different lineups. But you really hit the nail on the head where he's not going to take any minutes or like offensive responsibilities from like a Scruggs or even a Najee Marshall and kind of hinder their development. In terms of Marshall, he's one of my favorite players in the whole conference. I mean, he's so versatile. He's that perfect fit at the top of the 1-3-1 zone, kind of the role that JP Macura had the past few seasons. He's just so long and athletic and can hit shots. I mean, I think he's in for a really big year. Could maybe even see that 13 to 14 point per game range. And then at the point guard position, I think Quentin Good might be the most underrated player in the whole conference. I mean, he's so rock solid. He's super physical. He's a great defender. He can pass the ball. And I mentioned this earlier, but he shot 40% from deep in a Big East play. I think he kind of gets overlooked because last year they had Macura and Blewett, and then the year before he was kind of thrown into the fire when Edmund Sumner was hurt, and he really struggled until Xavier's Elite Eight run. So that's just another guy who I think is being vastly underrated both nationally and in the conference.
Yeah, I agree on all those fronts, especially on Marshall. I'm super high on him. I mean, I think the rotation is fairly clear to me in terms of how it's going to shake out. I think obviously Gooden will start at the point guard spot. The 3 will be Marshall. Wheeledge will start at the 4, and then you're going to have a fairly even split of minutes between Hankins and Jones. Probably somewhat of an even split in minutes between Scruggs and Castellan. There's your top 7. And then you're talking one backup guard, probably Elias Harden or Keontae Kennedy throw that into the backup as like your final backup reserve guard. And then one backup forward, probably Dontarius James. I think that's my top 9.
Yeah. So I wrote up a piece a few days ago trying to project Xavier's rotation. I just went with 8 because I thought, based on allocating enough minutes, I thought, every role and like every position was kind of covered with the top 8. And that was the 7 you mentioned. And I went with Elias Harden as that kind of experienced 8th man, which meant in my projections that none of the freshmen were going to be in the rotation. I kind of posted it on a Xavier forum to try to get some feedback. Very limited feedback. No one really had too too much of a problem, unlike my West Virginia one from a few weeks ago. But just kind of the biggest, like the only piece of feedback was that people think that Keontae Kennedy will get minutes over Elias Harden. So I mean that's kind of worth noting there. I don't think that there's room, as you mentioned, for both of them to play. So that'll be an interesting situation to monitor. Kennedy's obviously a shooter. Was committed to Chris Mack and then reopened his recruitment. Kind of looked at SMU among a few other schools. Louisville was another one, and then returned to Xavier.
Right. Yeah. I'm pretty 50-50 there. I think Harden's development will be interesting to watch, and I tend to bet on player development over freshmen playing at a school like Xavier. But yeah, I think the rotation is it kind of makes itself, which is always nice, especially given what we did last podcast with like 6 to 7 freshmen on each team, which was quite a joy. So I think we pretty much have our rotation nailed down, which means it's time to kind of think about where we stand on this team. And Brad, I'm interested to see what your thoughts are on this, because I'm pretty torn as to how much I like this Xavier club.
So after doing these deep dives, I think I'm all in on Xavier. I am probably the highest I've seen on them. I think it would be reasonable to put them in the top 25. I have them a little outside the top 25 as about a 7 or 8 seed, and then 4th in the Big East, one ahead of Providence and just behind Marquette and St. John's.
Yeah, I think that 4 to 6 range in the Big East is where I stand on them. I don't think I'm as high as you. I think they're an NCAA tournament team, but not all that clear cut, kind of in that 8 to 10 seed range. I think is probably where I sit. I'm concerned with how they're going to score the basketball. I think Marshall's good. I think Scruggs is good. But this is a team that really relied on its offense last season. They were not a very good defensive club. And obviously, Mikura wasn't a very good defender. Trayvon Blewett didn't actually defend all that well last season either. So that didn't help. But I'm not necessarily all that high on the defense improving enough, whereas to feel great about a team that really relied on a dynamic offense to succeed all of a sudden, taking a step back offensively. So that's probably my main concern. I'm having a devil of a time really projecting the Big East. I mean, I think Villanova is the clear number 1. I think Marquette and St. John's are my numbers 2 and 3, assuming Mustafa Heron's eligibility. Realistically, I think I like Xavier more than I like Butler, more than I like Creighton, more than I like DePaul, and more than I like Seton Hall, but a little less than I like Georgetown and Providence. So I think that probably puts them at 6, but it's the margins are really tight. So really that 4 to 6, 4 to 7 range is where I see this club. I think they're an NCAA tournament team. I think Travis Steele is going to do a good job with this club.
Yeah, so probably the main reason why I actually like them so much is I think that this has the potential to be an elite defensive team. I mean, you mentioned that Blewett wasn't a very strong defender, and then they, especially as the season went on, they gave a lot of minutes to Kerem Kanter, who was a absolutely horrendous defender at that center position. And I think between Gooden, Scruggs, and Marshall, and even Caslin, who I think will probably play the 6th most minutes, be that 6th man. Those are 4 really, big, athletic, versatile defenders, on the perimeter. And then between Jones and Hankins on the inside, that gives you some rebounding, gives you some potential rim protection. I think Wheelage is like the one weak link in the defense, but Marshall I think will play some 4 as well. So I think that this has the potential, especially with the size in the backcourt, to really be a disruptive and kind of overwhelming unit, especially on the perimeter in terms of defense. I do agree. I think the 3 biggest weaknesses for this team, or like the only 3 weaknesses really, but offensive production, the 3-point shooting, and then they have all these pieces in place. The roster fits incredibly well, but in order for them to meet my projection, a lot of their guys need to take major steps forward, which aren't unreasonable, but they still need to actually go out there and realize their potential and actually accomplish this.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think that's pretty much where I am. Let's wrap it up by our typical statement of where do we stand on a coach now. This is different because it's a first-year head coach. Were we all in on the Travis Steele hire? I certainly was.
Yeah, I mean, he's certainly recruited well so far with these grad transfers. And they have two top 150 guys in 2019 and a top 2020 guy already. So certainly good early returns on this hire.
Yeah, Jonas Hayes has been huge for them recruiting Georgia, so that's going to be pretty big. And I think Steele's a really good coach. He's been a guy I've had my eye on for a while. Is a guy that mid-major programs should have been trying to hire. Obviously, he'd interviewed for a few jobs, winds up taking Xavier before he has to take any a step in the middle, if you will, of a smaller mid-major program. But he's doing a good job. He's recruiting well, and he was such an invaluable part of this Xavier program before that. As far as a recruiter, I don't think they missed too much of a beat without Chris Mack, even though we do have to recognize him as one of the better coaches in college basketball.
And I think that'll wrap it up for Xavier. Moving on to Western Kentucky, our second team. They had a real bounce back season in 17-18. They were a top 50 team in KenPom. They were kind of a fringe bubble team, but they narrowly missed the NCAA tournament, lost by 1 point, I believe, to Marshall in the Conference USA Championship. Marshall then obviously went on to knock off Wichita State in the first round. But Western Kentucky made the NIT Final Four, finished 27-11 and 14-4 in the conference. They had a huge early season win that I don't think many people really understood the gravity at the time, but they knocked off Purdue in that crazy Battle for Atlantis tournament where Arizona was done for. They were cooked and they were beyond saving until they ended up being a 4 seed. But they got some excellent contributions from some veteran players, Darius Thompson, Dwight Colby, and a player who I loved, Justin Johnson, at that power forward spot. They were great at scoring in the paint with this physical front court, but they were 343rd in points off 3-pointers. And they rarely used their bench. They were 349th in bench minutes, partly because Josh Anderson and Mustafa Diane were ineligible for a good chunk of the season with some kind of, I think, transcript issues. And then they were also 345th in a minutes continuity, showing that this is one of the few examples of a team that's not bringing in the Duke or the Kentucky-esque recruiting class and are able to have such heavy roster turnover and still be successful, maybe because they were in a lesser conference. And they obviously did this without Mitchell Robinson, who had quite the offseason saga.
Right, and I think it was super impressive to me what they did last season, just because they were – I'm not going to say I left them for dead after Mitchell Robinson left, but this was a team that – the talent was certainly there, but I didn't think it was that overwhelmingly better than the rest of the conference to overwhelm the lack of experience in terms of playing together. Now, it all worked out because Darius Thompson and Dwight Colby were so good for this team and were such leaders. This was a very veteran, older team, playing. We talked about them as young and not necessarily connected, but Johnson, a senior, Darius Thompson, a fifth-year senior, Dwight Colby, a fifth-year senior, Lamonte Bearden was a fourth-year junior, and then they filled the rest out with freshmen. Hollingsworth was a huge rotation player for them, and I'm a huge fan. Jake Omer hit some big shots, including in that Battle for Atlantis, who's a 6'1" shooter. Josh Anderson came in late season and was really solid as like a wing defender. Merrick Nelson gave him some decent minutes, as well as even Diane, who wasn't impressive. But they scored the ball well. They were pretty switchable defensively. They were one of my favorite teams to watch in college basketball. So tons of credit to Rick Stansbury, who pretty much got the label of guy who can't coach but only recruits. And I think he coached this team pretty well last season. And I think they even have more talent this year. So it's going to be fun to watch.
Yeah, they're certainly deep. They have technically 14 guys right now. One shoe's going to have to drop there, I think. But there was points of time last season where they only had like 7 guys available, and guys like Nelson and Omer, they were okay, but clearly, some of the guys who weren't eligible were better options there, and they were kind of missing that kind of depth. And losing Robinson was huge. Especially we've seen how good Robinson actually is in the NBA Summer League and how what an athletic freak he is. But having like a senior center behind him, like Dwight Colby, was super lucky. At the time I didn't know why Colby was committed to them because he was going from the backup center at Kansas to being the backup center at Western Kentucky, but it certainly broke his way, and he had a great senior season.
Yeah, I definitely can't speak enough to how important that was, just getting Colby, and he was great. I mean, he protected the rim. He was great on the glass. They will miss him, but I'll run down some of the replacements they have, and this is a massive incoming group. I may miss one, so apologies if I do. I'll try to get them all. They have one graduate transfer. That's Deshaun Murray, averaged 10 and 6 at Auburn. This was a war to land him, and that's it. To me, it's a great get. Undersized four-man who's going to rebound, give you a little bit of spacing, plays really hard, and just a great leader to add to your ball club. Then they bring in one guy who's fresh off of sitting out last season as a transfer. That's Jared Savage, who's a athletic wing from Austin Peay who put up solid numbers there and then transferred out. And there's been a lot of good reviews on him. I don't know how much minutes he'll really project to play just because of the depth they'll have, but a good talent. They have two transfers who are they have just one transfer who's sitting out. That is Carson Williams, who comes in from Northern Kentucky. And then they also bring in two JUCO players. That's Trevelin Queen and Matthew Horton. Horton was a really big JUCO prospect, a 6'11 kid who can protect the rim, not a huge scorer, but really projects as a good backup center who runs the floor and contributes on both ends. Trevelin Queen was a high-scoring guard on the wing who is comes from a junior college. Averaged, I think, 27 points a game in JUCO or something crazy like that. I don't think he was playing at like a super high JUCO level, but projects as kind of a 3-and-D type piece from my understanding. Then the freshman class is really where a lot of the bread is won, if you will. Delano Banton, who was a good recruit at the time that Western Kentucky landed him, really had his stock rise during his time in prep school this season. One of us a top 100 recruit in the composite. He's at number 92. He's a 6'7" combo guard who can do a lot of different things on the floor. They also bring in Jeremiah Gambrell, who's a 6 foot, originally committed to Baylor, who's number 441 in the composite. Very shifty little guard who can play maybe as like a long-term sixth man. Galen Smith, who is from Hawaii, I believe, via Mississippi, 6'9" forward. And then, of course, Charles Bassey, 5-star, reclassifies from 2019 to the 18 class. I need a drink of water.
Yeah, I think the player in that kind of group that I'm most excited about is actually Deshaun Murray. I ranked him earlier in my top 30 grad transfers. I think I put him at number 6. I mean, this is a guy who averaged double figures at, for a top 10 team in the country for most of the season until Anthony McLemore went down with that injury. But, Murray, he's an undersized four-man. He can shoot a little, but he's just such like a tough physical player. I think he fits perfectly next to Charles Bassey. And then whenever you're in Conference USA and you can add a guy who averaged double figures in the SEC, that's a really huge addition, and he'll also make such a huge impact defensively too. Absolute home run, and then getting a guy like Charles Bassey, who's a 5-star recruit, like a big physical 5-man inside force. That's a really formidable front court that no one in Conference USA will be able to match up with.
Yeah, I ranked Deshaun Murray at number 3 in my mid-major power forwards. I think he's going to be really awesome for them. I don't think you can sleep on the impact that bringing in a fifth-year guy who's played a lot of college basketball and knows how to work will have on Charles Bassey. I think that's really important, just with Bassey's inexperience, potentially immaturity. So I think that's definitely something I'm excited to watch with this group, is that front court. They're just going to wreck teams in the Conference USA, both on the glass. I mean, Bassey's a tenacious rebounder, really dominated with his strength at Pangos. All-American camp, has had 2 MVP awards at that camp. That's where he's really made the bulk of his recruiting impact. So I think the front court there is pretty clear with either Horton or Diagne carving out front court minutes behind them. I would guess it's Horton right now, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, because on one hand you have Mustafa Diane, who is a former top 50 recruit, but he hardly played last season. I mean, we mentioned earlier he was ineligible for like two thirds, I think, of the season. And then whenever you come back that late in the season, I mean, it's hard enough to come back after the first semester, but I mean, just another whole third of the season on top of that is just so difficult. But he definitely didn't really seem like he would live up to that top 50 billing. But with a full season, a full off season under his belt, maybe he can establish himself as a solid backup center. I would also lean with Horton, who's like a long athletic. He has a great body, great physical tools. He seems like a more likely backup center. And then in terms of like the backup power forward, I think Merrick Nelson is probably the guy. He played about 9 minutes a game last year. I think he played in every game. Nothing too spectacular there. I mean, he's solid. Maybe more of a long-term guy, but he could definitely see a role there. Or maybe you have a guy like Josh Anderson who can slide down and play a lot of small ball forward behind Deshaun Murray as well.
Yeah, Nelson's minutes really took a dip once they added a little bit more depth, to which they didn't have just 7 players. So I would be a little bit surprised if he winds up being a rotation player for them. In fact, I wouldn't be entirely stunned if he winds up transferring at some point, whether that's now, mid-season, or after the season. But regardless, I actually thought he was a pretty useful player for Western Kentucky. I don't think he's bad at all. I think he's a definite D1 rotation piece. I'm really excited, though, to just watch the wings because, I mean, point guard's pretty much set with Bearden, although I think Banton might push him a little bit. I think Banton will also get a lot of time off the ball. But with Bearden, you have Anderson, who was awesome down the stretch last year, had some really bright moments. Hollingsworth, who is such an impressive player. And then even guys like Omer, Jared Savage, Trey Queen, one of those guys probably finds, and Banton, I think one or two of those guys that get boxed out of the rotation. I think Gambrell's not likely to play much, but there's just so many options, so much athleticism, and that looks like a high major backcourt if you just line them up. Those are high level recruits. Hollingsworth a high 3-star, Anderson a 4-star. Bearden had high major offers. Banton's a top 100 kid. Savage is super athletic. It looks the part to me of a team that's at large level.
Absolutely, yeah. I think the backcourt could split with like 30 minutes for Bearden, 30 for Hollingsworth, and then the 10 minutes that both combined to go to a Banton there. So he gets his 20 minutes as like the 6th man, and then Anderson can kind of split that spot with Anderson getting some more minutes than Jared Savage. Although Savage's shooting is going to be heavily relied upon, and maybe we'll see some lineups with Savage at the 3 and Anderson at the 4. So that's 7 right there. And then we said the backup center is Horton. And then I could see them sticking with 8, and then either Nelson or Queen is that 9th.
Yeah, that's pretty much right for me. I think that pretty much. I wouldn't want to sleep on Jake Omer, maybe just stealing minutes because he was useful last year and like I enjoyed watching him play. But at the same time, it's hard to find a spot for him unless you're going to play Banton a lot off the ball, especially given Omer's not really a point guard at 6'1". He's really just kind of a shooter off the bench, which is useful with their spacing. I think I could see him maybe in like a 5 to 8 minute of the game role where he just comes in, hits a couple shots, brings you some energy and toughness. But he doesn't provide anything defensively. It's tough for me to see him fall out of the rotation, but at the same time, it's definitely him or Savage. I can't really see a scenario in which Omer and Savage get minutes.
Yeah, and I would certainly think that Savage has the edge there. I mean, he averaged double figures at Austin Peay, I believe. And then Omer, yeah, I wasn't a big fan of what I saw last year. I mean, he seemed like he was only playing, kind of like what you mentioned with Nelson, because he was the first guy off the bench because I mean that's all they had. He only shot 31%, which I wouldn't necessarily say means he's a bad shooter because a lot of freshmen, even ones who were billed as a shooter, struggle to shoot in their freshman year. I would assume if he gets, whatever, a consistent 10 or 8 minutes a game, whatever, he would get if he were in the rotation, that percentage would increase dramatically. and just even playing on such a good team with a strong front court and these talented guards, he should have a lot of open opportunities. I just don't see like where to give him the minutes. I'm sure we could look back in March if they had like an injury or something, and he's playing a key role. Then maybe I look silly, but it's hard to kind of give a guy minutes when there aren't minutes just for the sake of it.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree with you. I think I'm a big Omer guy, and I'm big on that archetype of like little shooter who could type of thing, where he's just like he hustles, he plays hard. He played with a broken nose like all last season, so he's gonna wear a mask this year. It's like all about that grit and shooting. You love to see it. But overall, I think you're probably right. I think especially Bearden, such an established point guard, that Omer can't really play off the ball. He can't really, because he's so short defensively, he can't really play on the ball. He probably falls out of the rotation.
I mean, if he can guard ones, then him and Banton could play together with Banton being like 6'6", but yeah, I don't think it's likely.
Yeah, so I think we pretty much have our rotation in place, which would be Bearden, Banton, Anderson, Hollingsworth, potentially Savage, Murray, Bassey, and Horton.
That sounds good to me.
All right. So there's our rotation. I have any other just like general thoughts on Western Kentucky and concerns? I mean, I feel like they're just going to wreck teams in the Conference USA, which is their strength up front, where it'll almost be tough to evaluate how good or bad they really are, because their weakness at guard may just be overlooked by them dominating the rebounding margin and just getting extra possessions. And then not to say that their guards are weak, because I think they might have the best backcourt in the conference, but like it's hard to truly see the weaknesses of a team when they're playing with such superior talent to an opponent. This is what I'm kind of going at.
Yeah, I think that their backcourt is probably one of the best in terms of like the mid majors. But I think 3-point shooting is probably a big concern, especially. I mean, Hollingsworth shot a good percentage last year. Bearden, I think, was kind of below average.
Yeah.
And Murray is kind of capable, but it's not really his game. And then Anderson's not a shooter, and Bassey is not a shooter there. So that's why I think that Savage holds a lot of leverage there for a minutes. In terms of who do you think is like the X factor on this team? Like who do you think that Western Kentucky's success relies most on?
I think it's probably Anderson, just because his talent is there in terms of being like a Conference USA star. Like, we know Lamonte Bearden is a solid point guard who gets you out in transition, makes good decisions. We know that Tavion Hollingsworth can really shoot the basketball, can score at 3 levels, brings you a lot of energy. We know what Deshaun Murray is, and we probably know that Charles Bassey is going to be like a 14-10 guy in the Conference USA. I think that's like a pretty reasonable expectation. But like Anderson's ability to be like a super energetic, high-flying athlete, especially if he shoots it a little bit, and be like a one of the better players in the Conference USA, which is certainly what his talent dictates he could be. I mean, I think if Josh Anderson is what I think he might be this season, we go from this is a really good mid-major to this is a dangerous basketball team with like top 8 seed potential, possibly even a little higher.
Absolutely. And then it also kind of relates to like a similar thing that I think we're going to see with Nevada this year, and we see it with Gonzaga every year, where if they go like 16-2 or 17-1 in conference, how do you evaluate this team? Like beating in inferior competition, you can't kind of keep them static in the rankings. You kind of have to move them up. So it could get to a point where we look up and this is a team that's ranked in the top 10, but maybe they're more of like a top 30 team. How do you kind of evaluate that? And you kind of touched on that earlier with how do we evaluate their potential weaknesses, like maybe in the backcourt. But that's certainly a good problem to have. I think that teams like Marshall and Old Dominion, maybe even UAB are good enough where they could take a swing at Western Kentucky, maybe knock them off. So maybe that 17-1 record isn't as likely as like a Nevada or Gonzaga.
Yeah, I think the talent's definitely there for an at-large bid. We don't have a non-conference schedule to my knowledge, so it's a little bit hard to say whether they'll be, but whether they'll be like a lock at-large team. I think if they take care of business on the floor, they should be fine. But especially with that weird schedule the Conference USA is doing, where they're gonna like the last 4 games, I think it is, are wide open dates that will be decided by like the top 4 teams will play each other, and then like the 6th through 8s will play each other or something like crazy like that. That will allow for like more marquee win opportunities. That could also go against Western Kentucky. Like I think if it's 4 games, let's say they go 2-2 by losing road games to top 75 opponents, even though those are not bad losses. In fact, they might be quadrant ones. Like let's say top 100 to their quadrant 2 instead of their quadrant 1. It's still a bit of a concern for an at-large bid. And from a mid-major league, I don't think anything's to be taken for granted. But to me, this is a top 25 team, so I'm not too worried about it. But I think I think they would be in the top 25 if I published one today.
Yeah, so that goes into our next topic of where do you have them? So you clearly have them winning Conference USA, and then you said top 25. So where in the top 25? Like, do you have them at number 25, or like where do you see this team's upside?
Yeah, I think it's the back end of the top 25 is where I see them nationally. I think if I were to like rank the best teams in college basketball nationally, they'd be somewhere between 20 and 30. Where they'll wind up in the top 25 is really anyone's guess, because they could wind up, as you said, 31-2, and all of a sudden they got to be ranked pretty highly. I don't expect that to happen. I think they'll get beat up a little more than that, because the league, they play in a pretty good league. I don't think the Conference USA gets enough credit, and I think Stansbury will have some tests on the non-conference. Now I think they have Missouri State on their schedule. That should be a win, but they have Wisconsin on the schedule. That'll be a good game. I think they have Arkansas on the schedule. I'm not entirely sure on that, but there's a bunch of them. Where they'll have a chance for some solid, but not necessarily like definitively marquee wins. I think they're in a solid exempt event too. So they'll have a chance for some maybe like quadrant 1, quadrant 2 wins that'll solidify their at-large transcript. But if they can, put together a bunch of wins, they could really skyrocket in the rankings that in a way they don't necessarily deserve to.
Yeah, in terms of the rest of Conference USA, I extended my rankings a few days ago to my top 101. It came out to, because I forgot Illinois State, had to go back and put them in. So I had Marshall. This is very, very tentative at this point, but I had Marshall at 89 and Old Dominion at 92, which would put them kind of just outside that quadrant 1 if Western Kentucky would beat them on the road. But I think top 25 is certainly reasonable for Western Kentucky. The 3 main teams that we talked about today, between Alabama, Xavier, and Western Kentucky, I think I kind of feel the same way about all 3, where I don't have them in the top 25 right now. I certainly wouldn't blame anyone who does, or scoff at anyone who does. But all 3 I have in the kind of low to mid 30s. I have Western Kentucky as a 9 seed, which kind of puts them in that 33 to 36 range. Could be a little low. It is a little lower than where you have them, but certainly going to win Conference USA, and certainly an at large caliber club.
Yeah, I agree on all fronts, and it is always difficult to expect, unless they really put wins together, to expect a seed above a 9 for a mid-major. So that 9 to 11 range is probably right for a seed, even though they might be a top 25 team. Let's do our coaching evaluation. Where do we stand on Rick Stansbury? Obviously, he's gotten a reputation as one of the elite recruiters in the country. He's obviously gotten a lot of heat for the way he's handled Mitchell Robinson, the way he's handled Charles Bassey's guardian getting an assistant job. But the dude recruits and the dude wins. And at this level, I mean, you cannot complain at all about the results. You have to be really excited about the future of Western Kentucky under him and under Mark Sues, or an elite recruiter on that staff. And it's going to be really tough to knock them off their peg in the Conference USA when they consistently out-recruit you the way they are. I mean, they brought in now 4 top 100 freshmen in the last 2 classes, not to mention elite JUCO players, elite grad transfers. I mean, what more can you say from a recruiting perspective? I mean, these guys obviously know what they're doing.
Yeah, I think there's certainly no risk of him getting fired unless there's like a major like recruiting scandal. I think the bigger risk would be him going to a bigger program, which I guess it's likely. I mean, he's coached in the SEC. He did a great job as an assistant at Texas A&M in the SEC. So maybe if an SEC job opens up, maybe Stansbury gets the call. Maybe he's on the short list there. One thing that we didn't really touch on throughout our kind of deep dive is, do you think that there's any kind of worry about Charles Bassey not being eligible?
My understanding is that they're very confident he's eligible, that there's no issues. I know there was that weird big report of like what was the exact wording? Like the president of high school said he didn't have a degree, and you were like, uh-oh. But generally, I think he's fine from what I hear. I mean, I could check in with a couple people down there and kind of make sure, but the fact that it's been quiet to me indicates that all is well and that Bassey will not have a Mitchell Robinson ending.
Yeah, and it is interesting that they are currently, I believe, one over the scholarship, and maybe they're waiting to hear on Bassey's eligibility for certain until they make that last cut, or maybe, I mean, you never know with the NCAA when that could be resolved. I think it was Sheck Diallo was like a couple weeks into the season, same with like Alex Len too, about their eligibility decisions. So who knows how long the NCAA takes, or if they're even reviewing his at all. But I thought that was kind of an interesting observation I think I had, where they're one over and they have a high profile guy who could be up in the air in terms of eligibility.
Yeah, the one thing with that I will say is just the scholarship deadline is passed. So if they're one over, they've obviously told the person who's leaving that they're not getting a scholarship, because there's no way of forcing a player out after this deadline. I mean, you can't tell them you're not going to play, and they can't. I mean, you can tell them they're not going to play, but they can still say, I'm staying on scholarship, because you can't pull a guy's scholarship after July 1st. That was the renewal deadline. So unless it's possible that maybe one of the JUCO players, one of the high school players, doesn't wind up qualifying or making it to campus. Obviously, Bassey's the high profile one. It's possible that maybe like a guy like Nelson or like a guy like Nelson could be looking around, although I would doubt it. I think overall, though, you've got to think that either someone's not coming. Maybe Carson Williams would take a walk-on year while he's sitting out. I mean, you got to figure out some way of getting to the scholarship count. So wouldn't surprise me no matter what it is, but I'm really just hoping, and I don't think at this point that it will be Charles Bassey who's the problem.
That's like New Mexico State is like 3 or 4 over every year. I don't like they obviously make guys pay their own way, or maybe they have some sort of scholarship loophole where they're on like some like sort of full ride academic or whatever there. But it's always crazy like looking at their roster and trying to count the players again to like 16 or 17. It's like, well, this is who they're rolling with.
Yeah, it is a little weird. I don't know how all these schools work it out. I'm sure they will. I'm sure it's already in the works. I'm sure there's no concern, but definitely something to monitor. Whether maybe like a guy like Trevelyan Queen doesn't wind up making it to campus, which wouldn't be a complete stunner. So I think that's all we have really on Western Kentucky. And although I did want to mention real quick, your comment on Stansbury. Obviously, SEC programs could be interested, but at this point, he is 58 years old. He's not getting any younger, and I know that could be a bit of a turnoff for programs, especially given maybe the less than stellar reputation he has around college basketball. I wouldn't say he's blacklisted, but I think there's definitely there's kind of a widely accepted rumor, even though it may not be true, that there's some funny business going on. So it might be enough to keep programs away, and for Western Kentucky kind of luck into a elite coach for the next 6 to 8 years for their level.
How old is Kermit Davis though? Wasn't he like around 62?
Yeah, he was older. But I'm not saying it can happen at that 50 at that age, but I always generally think like after 55, it becomes a lot tougher to get one of these high major jobs, because you want that young up and coming star. You want a Nate Oates or a Will Wade type of situation. You don't necessarily want that guy who's going to take that guy who maybe only has 10 years in him or 5 years in him.
The Kevin Stallings.
Oh yeah, Stallings. That was a boom hire.
Well, I guess that does it for today, right?
Yes, sir. Thanks for listening, everybody. Tune in next week. We'll have another deep dive unless we somehow line up something else to do, which you never know. We are busy people. We try to bring you as good content as we can. Shout out to Brad, who's wrapping things up with his degree. So shoot him a tweet of a congratulations if you are so inclined. Things are rolling here for the CBB Central podcast. Thanks for listening. Hope you have a great night.